How does a Russia in retreat read the room at the United Nations General Assembly? On the day world leaders gather in New York for UN Week, Vladimir Putin's proxies unveiling plans for hastily staged referendums to annex conquered parts of Ukraine, parts that are now under assault from a big counterattack. How does that change the course of the war and the best efforts by struggling developing nations, which need that discounted Russian oil at a time of skyrocketing energy prices and the grain exports facilitated by a UN-brokered deal? At what point can the world continue to ignore an unprovoked invasion and the mounting evidence of war crimes committed on the Kremlin's watch? We'll ask our panel how those world leaders feel about mass graves and missiles that, far from the front, fall too close to nuclear power plants. Did last week's regional summit in Uzbekistan signal a turning point, one where the likes of India and China made it clear that Putin's campaign in Ukraine is bad for business more broadly? What's the UN's role at this crucial juncture? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if Vladimir Putin can go it alone. With us, retired French Ambassador Alain Leroy, who's the former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. Thanks for being with us. Across from you, a man you probably know well. He is retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the UN's, the French military mission to the United Nations. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back as well to public policy consultant Nyagare Bakayoko, chair of the African Security Sector Network. Good to see you. And sociologist Alexandra Bikbov, associate fellow at the Paris School of Higher Learning and Social Studies, EHESS. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The battlefield is changing fast in Ukraine, fast enough for the Moscow-backed separatist regimes of Donetsk and Luhansk to now call for a referendum on joining Russia. Joining the list all this Tuesday, Zaporizhzhia, home to Europe's largest nuclear power plant. And at the bottom of your screen there, Kherson, the first major city taken by the invaders at the start of the war.
We have charted a course to rejoin Russia, and there is no turning back. Based on the referendum results, I will personally appeal to the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, to legally approve them as soon as possible. I am sure this procedure will not take long.
Those referendums, General Trinquant, scheduled between this Friday and next Tuesday. What's Vladimir Putin's move here? Is this the prelude to a mass mobilization, something we've not seen yet since what Moscow calls that special military operation?
No, I think it's the third time that the schedule has changed. Initially, it was beginning of September. When the attack happened, it was November, and now it is announced now. Why? Because in communication, Russians have to have a big effort, because on the ground they've got big problems. So they just announced that. One of the points was that initially we found that if this was Russian territory, then the scale of the combat will change. That's wrong. It never happened. When they was attacked in Crimea, which was supposed to be Russian since 2014, nothing changed. So I think it's just communication. They are not able to communicate on what's happening on the ground. So they try to skip this problem and to go on this legal problem, and everybody will in UN will talk about the legal problem.
Well, Alexander Bikbov, let me ask you, do you think that this is the Ukraine, which is saying we're going to continue on with this massive counteroffensive, do you think that this could then be the way to prepare Russian public opinion for a mass mobilization that so far Vladimir Putin has avoided?
I doubt it has to do with the mobilization, because the mobilization is now half announced. In some way, it continues in the last 2 or 3 weeks. There are public enterprises which are now distributing appeals to workers to enroll in the army. There are
But appeals to enroll in the army is one thing. Drafting people
That's
into the
it.
army is another.
That's it. And there is no connection because the referendums, which were already held in Crimea in 2014, are considered as a symbolic action other than a moral support of the mobilization.
People, and Roy have said that it's either the war continues at its current pace now, or Moscow makes use of its nuclear arsenal. But there is, of course, a third option, which is it simply decides to up the targeting of civilian infrastructure.
They have already started to target the civilian infrastructure. It's already done by the Russian troops.
But if these parts of Russian-occupied Ukraine are attacked with ground forces by Kyiv's army, does that give an excuse to Vladimir Putin to then carpet bomb big cities?
He has no excuse for doing what he's doing. We all know what everything he's doing in Ukraine is completely illegal. And I just want to say one word. I hear people don't know exactly what is right or not. There has been a clear vote in the United Nations. 141 countries out of 193 countries, more, it means 3/4 of the United Nations have condemned clearly the invasion, and even more. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, condemned it, asked to cease Russia to cease immediately its operation. All that is completely illegal. He has attacked a country within its internationally recognized border, and any referendum will not change the path. Even in Crimea, the borders of Ukraine are internally recognized by the United Nations, and no referendum, no illegal referendum as it is, will change that.
Negele Bakayoko, we heard earlier the speech at the rostrum of the UN by the president of Senegal, acting chair of the African Union, and he was really trying to stay out of it, Macky Sall. Is that the general mind frame across Africa, you think? Still today?
The position of African states is very difficult to read, in fact, because when the first vote about supporting or not the UN resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine was presented, half of the African state supported it, 17 decided to abstain, and the other part just not show off. So, in fact, we can see that most of African countries are trying to find a medium position, not really supporting any camp, but others are definitely very active and showing rather strong support to Russia itself. And I think that the African continent is one of the most critical in terms of international support, which can be reflected at the UN level.
Can be reflected at the UN level. We've seen the divide over the fact that you've had the mercenaries of Wagner in places like the Central African Republic and Mali. But does that support for Russia begin to wane when they see the strong man in Moscow losing on the battlefield?
That's where it could become very challenging for some countries, such as Mali or the Central African Republic, because in fact, just before the war in Ukraine began, Malian authorities have decided to change their alliance. Traditionally, they were very close to the Western camp, especially to France, and they thought that it might be much more efficient on the ground to be allied with Russia, and in particular with this private security company, Wagner. But what is happening today is that we can see that even in Mali, and also in a lesser extent in the Central African Republic, they are not getting any more results than their Western counterparts. So this, in addition to the very bad perception of Russia internationally, could make their option to become very difficult to sustain.
I want to talk about that perception in a moment, but first, just one question. Again, General Trinquant, are you surprised at this Ukrainian counter-offensive. We can listen just to one soldier that our correspondent Gulliver Cragg spoke to, the Ukrainians themselves expressing that surprise.
We went on the attack and took one of their positions. We occupied it, fortified it. 3 days later, the fronts moved on, and they all started to scram. We were ready to fight, but for them to just abandon the whole front line, we really weren't expecting that.
No, I think it was a very well prepared offensive. I'm not talking about counterattack, but offensive. In the south, it was well prepared with long-range firing in depot and ammunition and all that. But also the announcement of the attack in the south made that the Russian forces were moved from the north to the south. So the north was very weak. And there was two Ukrainian brigade, well prepared, well equipped, which attack. And that was the result of that. And what we'll see is what will happen after that. Will they be able to exploit this first victory, crossing the river, what they have done yesterday, and following the attack? This I don't know. But in fact, the fact that they were able to move on two offensives in the south and the north at the same time and gain a lot of ground in the north and in the south, in fact, isolated the Russian forces with the Dnieper, impossible to cross. I think it's a very well prepared offensive, and the Ukrainians are showing that they are able to do that, and that's a success, of course.
That Ukrainian soldier we heard, he was surprised. Were you surprised, Anna?
I think we were all surprised first by the offensive by the Ukrainian, but also we all know now that they have a lot of intelligence from their allies, the US, EU countries, of course. It's somehow surprising that the Russians were able to flee and not even to fight. That I think says a lot about the moral of the Russian troops. But at the same time, we want to be cautious. It's clear that there is an offensive, rather successful so far, but there remain still hundreds and thousands of Russian soldiers with heavy equipment in Donbass, in the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk. So the offensive is progressing, but how far, nobody knows at this stage.
Alexander Bikbov, what evidence do you see when it comes to this issue of morale? And does the Kremlin care about morale? They can play the long game. We heard the Ukrainian soldiers saying that they were outnumbered 3-1.
For sure, Kremlin cares about the morals, and the sending of icons and candles to Russian troops on the Ukrainian territory shows that there is a kind of attempt to catalyze the moral with religion, for example. And more generally, there is a quite an important concern about the support of the war activities in Ukraine by the Russian population, because something which is not widely reported is happening in Russia since March. For example, at least a dozen of police and military headquarters were attacked in different Russian cities by Russian citizens. And there are quite massive
Who attacked them?
I may say ordinary people, if you wish, who are against war, who are against the immense drawback of the Russian quality of life and moral implications of the war. So there are many forms of protest which are not massive, which don't take a systematic form of resistance, but still it's widespread, and Kremlin is quite concerned about this.
All right, there's also, when we're talking about morale, we're also talking about morals. There was Irpin and Bucha back in the spring, suburbs of Kyiv retaken before Russia could conceal evidence of atrocities. Now there's Izium, the northeastern city, retaken in that surprise Ukrainian counteroffensive. Last Friday, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg filed this report.
Some residents of Izium, who don't yet have internet access, still don't know this site exists. It was hidden behind Russian army positions in the woods on the edge of town. But on Friday it was under the spotlight of the world's media that municipal workers and investigators began their grim work.
Нами ексгумовано, може, 25. Бачите, ми закінчили з цією могилою. Зараз ми упаковуємо труп та переходимо через крок до іншого. І так ми будемо здійснювати слідчі дії до повного відпрацювання цієї території.
Some were buried with their documents.
Місто Дніпропетровська область. На таке ж ім'я.
Водійське посвідчення.
Посвідчення водія.
Службовців Збройних сил України. Причина смерті буде встановлена після розтину.
The explosions are the work of demining units nearby. Soldiers here appear to have been buried in mass graves, civilians individually. Local undertakers said many were killed by bombs or rockets during Russia's assault on Izium in March and reburied here later. But not all.
Було віднайдено мотузку, яка міститься на шиї, та ознаки, що ця мотузка примінялась для механічної асфіксії. Тобто, можливо, він був задушений.
What you can't see in the pictures is the terrible stench of death permeating this forest. It's not yet known exactly how many people there are here, nor exactly how they died. But what is clear is that they were all alive before Russia's invasion started on February the 24th.
Gulliver Cragg, who's returned since to that wooded area, a forensic pathologist showing him at least one case where it's obvious that there was torture, signs of torture on one of the corpses. And that brings me back, Nyangere Bakayuko, to what you were saying. We talked about the perception of the war with Alexander inside of Russia. How about in the rest of the world?
In fact, unfortunately, there are also this kind of huge massacre, huge human rights abuses that we can find in countries such as the Central African Republic and Mali. When the Bucha massacre happened a few days before, there were also massacres in Gossi, in Omburi, in Mali. And what we can see is that all the states which are associated today to Russia can see that their own image can be damaged because of the lack of respect shown by more broadly Russian military actors or paramilitary actors. So I think it is also doing a lot of harm to those states supporting Russia.
And you've seen public opinion start to turn, because we've talked about this before on this show, about how Russia's public information campaigns are very effective in Africa. And you're seeing public opinion starting to turn against Moscow?
No, definitely not. On the contrary, I would say what we can see is the fact that Russia is seen as a very serious alternative to Western traditional partners, which are growingly perceived as first having failed in countering insecurity, but also as having promoted democracy or human rights in a bad way. And we can see that there is a lot of distrust against Western partners, but broadly. Initially, the anger was targeting France, but we can see today that it is growing up against other Westerners. And what is the issue at stake is the fact that we can see that alliance with those actors, Russia, but also China, who are opposing Western model, are gaining growing support in public opinions, at least in Western Africa.
At least in West Africa. General Trinquant, again, it was the question I put earlier to Nyangere. Will that continue if Russia's losing on the battlefield?
I think that the propaganda from Russia is very effective. It's very effective in Africa too, as Nyangere just said, because you will not convince people who wants to fight anyway a certain way of ruling, of living about the country. They are convinced that the Russians are providing them an alternative, and whatever means are on the table. And they are not looking at the means which are on the table. I mean, a lot of these people are paid by Russian, and but they are convinced, you know, we're talking about Mali. The head of state in Mali were educated in Russia. So, you know, they are part of this propaganda, and it will be very difficult to change this propaganda. But what is sure is that if they are losing in Ukraine, there will be difficulty to follow on this line in Africa, of course.
Alain Leroy?
Yes, maybe I would like also to add that the support for Russia by its allies, I don't speak about African countries, but other allies, what we have seen in Samarkand recently.
Yeah, this was Uzbekistan, that summit that took place at the end of last week.
Exactly, and there was a declining support, I would say. What we heard from Mr. Xi Jinping, then he said, even Mr. Putin had to say that China has some difficulty with this. He had to even the Indian Prime Minister had to say he wanted the war to stop as early as possible. We heard President Erdogan saying there must be a diplomatic solution with all Russian troops out of Ukraine. So it's clearly the support, the international support to Ukraine is on the
Were you
decline.
surprised to hear that from the Turkish president, the Indian prime minister, since that discounted Russian oil is so important for them at a time of high inflation?
Yes, for me, they need Russia, as you say, for their oil. At the same time, they were able to say they are rather critical toward the war in Ukraine. Because it's obvious. I guess also it's because on the military side, Russia is is losing ground in some way. So, and they are saying that. So they don't want to support some country who is so badly condemned by by the ICJ and the UN, of course, and also because so far, we'll see, again, I'm cautious, but so far, Russia is losing grounds.
If you look back at Samarkand meeting, very interesting is that the leadership of Putin was really challenged, even in Central Asia. Yeah. He discovered during the meeting that Kyrgyz and Tajik were fighting. 20 years or 30 years ago, it was impossible. They will have refer immediately to Putin and try to sort out the problem.
Same with Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yes, I mean, but in Central Asia, these two countries, which are poor countries, in fact, are really were under order of Russia previously, and now they are doing what they want, and Putin is not part of the loop. So his leadership is really challenged in this part of the world too.
Alexander Bikpov, I'm sorry to make you play Kremlinologist here. Does Vladimir Putin care about what foreign leaders think?
Certainly yes. And I would say that here we may observe the limits of the propaganda, which is considered as effective looking from the European context and extremely ineffective looking, for example, from the Ukrainian context. The Russian propaganda was based and is still based on the thesis of the Holy War. At the same time, the idea to continue the Holy War in the territories which are not so-called Nazificated is something which brings a real problem in terms of political treatability of the war and the credibility of the Russian government in front of foreign leaders, including their allies. So, for example, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the governments of these societies just could not accept entering the Russian army on the territory, which is a threat. I mean, potential threat. It's not articulated, but still.
Well, they saw it happen in Kazakhstan recently, where the Russians went in as peacekeepers, and the Kazakhs don't want that to happen again.
That was an example of the contrary, because everyone expected that the Russian army stayed in Kazakhstan after the operation is over, but they didn't. So it was more or less the idea of the plan, of the initial plan, to make a kind of surgical operations, which was also conceived at first in Ukraine. It didn't happen, And in some way, making referendums and making some other symbolic actions is a way to demonstrate that the plan still exists and it stands up.
Let's talk about the United Nations now in all of this. Alain Leroy, you have the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, headed to New York. He's going to represent Moscow during this UN week. What do you expect?
I would like to say a word about the UN at this stage, where the UN, many people are rather critical toward the UN, saying the UN is no more relevant, it's completely blocked, especially by Russian attitude, a Russian veto.
Russian veto at the Security Council.
At the Security Council. I would say I would have a different view. First, as you just said, during this week, you have 150 head of states coming to the UN for the gathering of this week. So they consider the UN is relevant. They come by themselves. We don't have, of course, Xi Jinping. We don't have Putin himself, but we have Lavrov. And again, 150 head of states and governments. Very important. Second, the UN has been they couldn't stop the war, but has been very active in many ways. Of course, UNHCR for the refugee crisis, WFP for humanitarian crisis, even the IAEA, the nuclear agency is also a branch of the UN. They are the one in Zaporizhia. It was also the UN who, together with Turkey, who were able to clinch a deal about the wheat to be exported both from Ukraine and Russia. So, I mean, yes, so far the Security Council is blocked on Ukraine by a Russian veto, but at the same time the Security Council is still functioning on many other issues. Just, for example, continuing the mandate of the UN peacekeeping mission. There are still votes, and Russia votes in favor. So it's blocked on Ukraine, but it's not blocked on all the other crises. That's very important to settle.
Better to have Russia in the tent than out of it.
I would tend to disagree a bit. For instance, on Africa, there are a lot of problems because of the situation of the UN Security Council. But where I would agree is that we can see inside of the decision-making process of the UN itself, we can see shifts in decision-making circles. For instance, the resolution condemning the Russian aggression was taken by the UN General Assembly, and it was a kind of reminder of what happened with the Atrocities resolution years ago. We saw also that there has been also a vote, an important one, at the level of the Human Rights Commission within the UN. So I think that the UN can definitely not be considered only via the UN Security Council, as you just mentioned. But I think that this tension between, on the one hand, Russia and China, and on the other hand, France, United States and United Kingdom, is causing lots of problems to solve crisis, especially on the African continent.
Yeah, a lot of our viewers watching us are in places like Ethiopia right now.
Exactly, absolutely. That's what I was thinking about.
General Tancon.
Yeah, I think following what you've just said about the General Assembly, very interesting to see all the head of state present. And tomorrow the briefing by the President of Ukraine will be very interesting. First, he was allowed to do it with the majority of the people asking for it. Secondly,
yeah, because usually, just to remind our viewers, there's a protocol issue, right? If the president doesn't come, you have to be represented by somebody else.
Exactly. Second point, we'll see how many countries will show up, will be present in the big room of the General Assembly.
Zelensky will speak.
Yeah, exactly, because during the speech, very often people are moving out, and so we'll see who will be there, and all the camera will look at what will happen after the speech. Because, when President Zelensky is speaking in front of several parliaments, everybody stand up and applaud. Then you will see what will happen. And the people will have to move or not move. And that will be very interesting because there will be a momentum, After that, if all the room is stand up and applauds, then you will look at the people who are not there.
And you will see then when Sergei Lavrov will speak, what will be the reaction of the General Assembly. That will be very interesting.
It will be very, this is the sort of theater, you know, and you will see whether the spectators are there or not.
Will there be empty seats among the African countries?
I don't know, but what happened a few months ago when Zelensky made a speech before the African Union, only 4 African countries attended his own speech. So it might be a signal of what could happen tomorrow after the speech you mentioned.
All right. One of the remits of the United Nations, of course, as Ambassador Leroy was mentioning, is to act as that talk shop where peace can be brokered. When he spoke to France 24 and RFI this past weekend, the UN Secretary General was pessimistic when it comes to the war in Ukraine. He saw 2 sides unwilling to make peace.
The prospects for negotiations are very far off. I believe that both the Ukrainians and the Russians think that they can win the war, and I don't see any possibility in the short run to establish serious peace negotiations.
Can't make peace if the 2 sides don't want to sit down. That's a given, Anna Leroy. Again, what can the UN? Is it the UN that can unblock this, or?
So far, the UNSG, I think, is perfectly right. We don't see the time for negotiation now, that's for sure. Everyone thinks the same. At the same time, the day there will be place for negotiation, the UN will be there. Mr. Guterres and all his envoys will be there. Also because all his agencies are on the ground for humanitarian, for food support. But for the diplomatic side, also the UN shall be there. At this time, it's impossible these days, but the UN, I'm sure, will be ready.
Alexander Bikpov, how much does the UN matter to Russia?
That's a good question, because in the affair of the non-delivered visas to the half of the Russian delegation, the UN mattered, but not directly. It was more considered a bit in the way as it was considered in the Soviet times, as an arena of political competition other than a real tool of resolution of problems. And besides, it's now really a question at which condition the war could be stopped and the peace could be negotiated. I think that both sides, both governments, manifested in quite a clear way that they could not accept any opponent's vision of the peace. So in this context, the UN matters as a symbolic, once again, as a symbolic space, but maybe not as an instrumental or a problem solution space.
As far as there are combat on the ground, the Ukrainians know that they can reach victory, so they don't want to stop. They want to continue the war. And Putin can't lose the war. I mean, if he's losing the war, he's losing power. And so we don't see now how we can solve the problem. And certainly, as it was said...
Because our Moscow correspondent said that one of the possible scenarios is, again, I get back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, is these referendums draw a line in the sand and make it possible then for those peace talks to begin.
I don't see it like that.
Both sides are for total war.
Exactly. President Zelensky clearly said that he wants to conquer all the ground which has been conquered by the Russian. And all European countries and the Americans are saying the same, going back to the former border. So there is no, I mean, it is sand, so it is moving. But it is moving back to the initial borders, and the Ukrainian will not stop. And currently, we don't know how it will happen in a few weeks on the ground, but currently the Ukrainians are winning on the ground certain part of the combat, and so they will not stop.
And the minute you send in UN peacekeepers, you fixate the problem.
We are not there yet.
That's not there yet.
We are not there yet.
No, but we did try to. We did have this floated the suggestion around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That was one of the ideas that was floated.
But to have to send UN peacekeepers, you need to have the agreement of both sides, and we are far to get there. We are not there yet, and now everyone is trying to mediate, but. As you said, President Macron, President Erdogan, and the UN. So far, it's not the time for negotiation, for sure. Unfortunately, of course.
And Anwar, you were head of UN peacekeepers when there was the war in Georgia. Mm-hmm. Is it the same Vladimir Putin?
To me, rather, I would say yes. I say people are surprised by Vladimir Putin. But for me, I've seen what he has done in Georgia, in South Ossetia, in Abkhazia. I've seen, of course, what he has done in Chechnya.
That lasted 12 days, Georgia.
Yeah. Sorry?
It lasted for 12 days, the actual fight.
For 12 days, but it was stopped. And France played an important role at that time. President Sarkozy played an important role to convince President Putin not to go further. But we have seen what he has done also, we all know, in Chechnya, in Syria. So it's, and for me, it seems Vladimir Putin. And I heard President Obama saying he's in some way ruthless. I think it's a good way to describe his how he behaves.
It's the same Vladimir Putin, Alexander Bikbov?
Well, in this field, I really enter to the realm of pure hypothesis. I would say that the epidemic changed quite much Vladimir Putin, not as an individual, but as a collective construction. His communication with the experts, with the counselors, with everyone who were composing a kind of balance in between pro-Western and isolationist trends.
So COVID changed that?
Yes, because he isolated himself in quite a drastic manner, and he reduced quite drastically the circle of experts who were accessing the direct communication with him.
Earlier in the day, we saw images of him with the Bosnian Serb leader, and there they were around that big table, the one where he was at one end and Macron at the other. But this time, they were sitting much closer. They were sitting in the middle. Both were in the middle of the table. So, could it change again?
But it's the question is to whom he's now ready to approach.
Nyagare Bakayoko?
No, yes, the image you're just mentioning was really, yes, thank you, was really impressive. And I think that lots of people in Africa have used this to show
the one you mean with Macron, the one where they were both
exactly
at the,
the one,
at
yes,
the
not
long
this one,
table.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
With Emmanuel Macron at the other side of this so long table. This is an image which has been used, manipulated, and instrumentalized to show how France was losing ground in comparison to Russia in Africa.
We've got another variable that's coming up on the battlefield, and that's the advent of winter. We'll see how that changes the scale. But how does it change public opinion in the West? You're a former ambassador to Italy, and there's an election coming up on Sunday. And with those energy prices going through the roof, does Vladimir Putin, will he have new friends in Rome come Monday morning?
I don't think so. You have seen the declaration of the potential future Prime Minister in Italy, Mrs. Meloni. She is completely in favor of continuing the sanctions against Russia. That's very important.
Because put aside Hungary, up to now, you have a united front within the European Union.
And she has a different view on Hungary. But on Russia and the Ukraine crisis, she has exactly the same views that her predecessor, Mr. Draghi, again, in case she is elected in a few days. No. And then, my key point is what Putin has in mind. I think he would still need allies. Allies, of course, China is very important for him, and maybe also having some kind of support from India and others. And that, for me, the key point. And in the UN General Assembly, we will see how far will come that support. And as President Macron said, the key point is to avoid the fracturation, the break of the UN. Probably the idea is to isolate Russia, including from its allies, showing the reality on the ground, first the war crimes, and also the military situation. I think that will have quite an impact on China, India, and others. And it's very important for France to keep the link, the lien with all these countries to show their reality and to hopefully isolate Russia in his completely illegal war.
Alexander Bikbov, the French president, who has said ahead of his speech before the UN General Assembly that he's going to continue arms supplies to Ukraine. Moscow criticized him for that, but also saying he wants to talk again. He wants to keep the dialogue open with Vladimir Putin. How's that viewed in your view, among public opinion and among the higher circles of power there?
I think this is, now if we speak about Russian perception, it's of minor importance because the general air of isolation is now established, and finally who speaks and who doesn't speak to Russia, to Russian government, doesn't matter so much in terms of international news and events coming from the United States and the European Union. I would say that what is more important is an image constructed now, an image of the collective West, which is gaining back the propaganda and the imagination in both negative and positive senses.
Yes, I fully agree, because in fact, of course, it's important to look at war, to look at the military balance, to look at energy. But what is at stake, in my view, is also competition for norms and values and political models. And that's what we could see, not only, even if China is showing a kind of change in its position, I think there is definitely lots of proximity between Russia and China, because they definitely want to promote an alternative model in terms of political model and norms and values. I think it's very important.
And it's why this General Assembly is key for me.
And for this, exactly.
It comes at a time where France want to avoid the divide between the UN. Of course, we have to condemn the Russian attitude, but at the same time, it's very important to continue the discussion with all the other countries, China, India, Turkey, and others. And for President Macron to continue to try to speak to Mr. Putin, as the UN is doing. Mr. Guterres was in Moscow and others also.
Dominique Trinquant, you heard Alexander Bikbov say that right now, okay, the Russians know they're isolated. And so when you have, like you might see at the UN Security Council, when they have meetings during UN week, Sergei Lavrov and his US counterpart, Antony Blinken, in the same room, it won't matter? It'll just be speaking for the gallery, or will something happen?
Well, I think it's very interesting that Mr. Putin didn't dare to go in the UN. He made the choice to send Mr. Lavrov, who knows very well the UN. He spent 7 years as ambassador there. And so just go for it, and we'll see what will happen, because he will probably feel very isolated. And I think that President Putin doesn't want to be more isolated than he is now. But just going back on the position of President Macron, I think in Europe it's very difficult, because in Europe you are for or against. And it's very difficult to be just in the middle, you know, la puissance d'équilibre, the famous
balance of power.
To do a balance.
And that's very difficult, because a lot of Eastern countries don't want at all. You know, they even don't want to give visa, they don't want to Russian music, etc. You are against or you are with. And so, but I think it's the right position, because we will have to talk to the Russian anyway at one stage.
All right, and that will be our final word for now. Much more to happen, as our panel says, during this UN week. I want to thank you, Dominique Trinquant. I want to thank as well Niagare Bakayoko, Alain Leroy, Alexander Bikbov. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.